This video is going to teach how to inverse a function in two different ways. It's the same function both times, y equals 2 times x minus 1 squared plus 3. So, the first thing you want to do is each line in math has to be the same as the line above in terms of it represents the same equation. But right now we want to find the inverse. So you need to indicate to the reader, hey, I'm inversing. This is not equal to the line above. What does inverse mean? It means switch the x and y. So I'll rewrite this equation, but inversed, where the y becomes x and the x becomes y. And now the rest of the work is just getting the y by itself. So, how do we get the y by itself? Work everything else around it. Starting with inverse operations, we have to do the opposite things. Normally, when you're solving something, you deal with the brackets and the exponent first, but we're trying to clear off this y. So clear off the farthest thing away, it's this plus 3. How do you get rid of plus 3? Take away 3 both sides. And you're left with x minus 3 equals 2 times y minus 1 squared. Now deal with this this 2. I gave it away. What's the opposite of times by 2? I'm going to divide by 2 both sides. When I do that, I get x minus 3 over 2 equals, these 2's cancel out like we want to, and you get y minus 1 squared. Now, how do you get rid of a square? What's the opposite of squaring? Most people are going to say square root, and you're partly right, but the opposite of a square is not just square root, it's plus or minus square root. So make sure when you square root both sides, you put plus or minus. That's a mistake I often see. And also make sure your root covers the top and the bottom, goes all the way down, covering this denominator. Okay, well if you've done that, then you've got a square root plus or minus canceling out a square, leaving y minus 1. And on the right hand side, sorry, on the left hand side, we've got plus or minus square root of x minus 3 all over 2. All that's left to be done is get rid of this minus 1. What's the opposite of minus 1? Plus 1. Note though that plus 1 doesn't go in the root. Let's rewrite it. Plus or minus the square root of x minus 3 divide by 2. Do all of that, and then on the outside add 1. That's your equation. So we can write a therefore statement. Sometimes I like it. Therefore the inverse equation is y equals plus or minus the square root of x minus 3 all divided by 2. All of that's inside the root, but then plus 1. That's how to do it using algebra. But there's another way. Here's the second way, which is first list the steps, list the transformations you see in order, and we'll write them as mathematical operations rather than transformations. So first I see in these brackets, subtract 1. Then after you subtract 1, I see square. Subtract 1, then square everything. Then multiply by 2. So subtract 1, square it, multiply by 2, and add 3. So you can do this a more verbal way, is now you've got to indicate to the reader again you're going to inverse those steps. And if you're doing it this way, here's the key. You inverse both the order and the type of operation. So instead of going subtract, square, multiply, add, I'm going to go the other direction and switch all the operations. So start with this add. What's the opposite of add 3? Subtract 3. What's the opposite of multiply by 2? Divide by 2. What's the opposite of square? Well, we learned previously the opposite of square is square root plus or minus. And what's the opposite of subtract 1? Add 1. And so now from these inverse, that is switch their order and switch their operations, from these new inversed steps, we can write the equation. Y equals, start with your x and subtract 3. So start with my x, subtract 3, then divide all that by 2. Divided by 2. Then take the square root plus or minus. And finally, after all that's done, add 1. Look, same equation. And that's how you inverse a function. You have two choices. Either you write the word inverse, switch the x and y, and get the y by itself, or you list the operations and then inverse both their order and the operation type.